glad to be with Arunava and Anindita. Both of them are, celebrated writers, translators, thinkers, journalists. So, Indian tales, at one point, a very well-known writer said that Indian writings happen only in English. And about a week ago, someone said that, Indian English novel has lost its sheen and everything happens in Bhasha. Now, my first question is to Arunava, because I know how passionate you are about translations, is that when we have a book which is originally written in Hindi, which probably in the beginning nobody thought that will get that much attention, wins a Booker Prize and it changes everything. How do you look at it as a translator, as Indian tale, or the stories that are being disseminated now from this subcontinent?
Eventually, it proves that old theory all over again, right? That until you're recognized in the West, you don't get any acclaim over here, attention or interest over here. But my point is, if that's the reality, then that's the reality. And there's no point wringing our hands over it. But now that we've been fortunate enough to get that attention, maybe the question to ask is, how can we use it? So while it is fantastic that A Tomb of Sand is being sold and presumably also being read in huge numbers, what can we do to ensure that more such books are in the slipstream of this momentum and can be read, and that this becomes an ongoing phenomenon and not a flash in the pan? I think that's something that we should be thinking about.
So more enthusiasm should be to acquire good translation. Editors should spend time in championing them. Having said that, I know that Anindita writes in English. But when we were having this conversation, Anindita pointed out something very interesting, and I could connect with what you were saying, is that, many of us often don't think in English, but we write in English. People who have lived in many parts of India or maybe, lived abroad, they probably think in many languages. Anindita said that she thinks in many languages. So Anindita, when you bring to light a story, in this context, your book, which you brought out from HarperCollins, how do you look at this entire idea of conceiving this story, and then eventually presenting this story to the audience?
So I think most Indians are rather privileged in the sense that we are multilingual. We at least speak 2 languages, if not 3. In my case, I am what the Bengalis called a Probhashi Bengali. So I was born in Calcutta, but I grew up in Bombay. So apart from English, Hindi and Bengali, I understand Marathi, I understand Gujarati. I did my master's thesis on Tangkhul Naga. I learned some French, Italian, Spanish. But for various reasons beyond my control, English is the only language I write in. It's a colonial hangover, I'm a product of colonization, etc. I feel that with this increased interest in translations now, I'm often made to feel ashamed that I can't read in Bengali or that I don't write in Bengali. Now it seems almost that writing in English is like, kind of being a second-class writer. I get this feeling because the jury system, the journalism system we are all celebrating translations, which is great. I just feel that English is also an Indian language, like other Indian languages now, so it should not come at the cost of writers writing in English, because it's the only language I can write in for whatever reason. That said, in linguistics we have this term called registers, which we were speaking about, and again, we think in so many registers, and that's a privilege, the fact that you can switch to, my book has Hindi words, Bengali words, Sanskrit words, everything. And I was so happy that editors let that be. I think publishing is also, moving towards a space where you celebrate localization, because there were Bengali words in my Indian edition that even a reader from, say, Delhi might not understand, but we haven't translated it. So I think it's a privilege, the idea that you can think in many registers, and even if I'm not consuming literature directly in that language, I feel I know a lot of Bengali literature because my grandmother used to read out Ashapurna Devi to me. I studied Tagore songs, Rabindra Sangeet for 8 years. So I feel I know a registry of 100 Tagore poems. But I don't read Bengali. But I watch Hindi movies, I watch Malayalam movies, and we have access to all those registers to dip into. And I think that's a privilege. Yeah.
Precisely, and truth be told, English is now an Indian language, right? I know that in many families, people often communicate in English because we are moving towards a more like a cosmopolitan, kind of a setup. Having said that, Arunava, I read everything you translate, From the very beginning, the first book, Chorongi, that you translated, which was I would say that it was a kind of a phenomenal success in the field of translation. Means I was there when the book was launched. I was not into publishing then, but I was inspired. Question is that, what kind of Indian tales, maybe, it was about 12, 13, 14 years ago when you brought out Chorangi, then Middleman you published. What kind of Indian tales were, in demand then, or, and when you look at it now, and when we look at your body of work, it's now very eclectic, very diverse. How do you look at it? At that time, were you the person who was selecting the books, or now, how do you do the selection process? I find this really fascinating, seeing your body of work.
I want to add to that question for you, that is it just star writers who are being translated, or have translators and publishers identified a type of story or a type of narrative that works well in translation? I'm quite curious.
Yeah, so first of all, the moment you get into this, what kind of book should be translated or read, then I think we're in trouble. Because then you're just trying to repeat one success in another form, which doesn't really work for great writing. I mean, good books are, I think, successful because they surprise you, because they do something that you did not expect would be done. Also, I think we this break between English and translation and so on, we also overplay this whole thing. It's become a bit of a phenomenon. It's something to talk about. But really, we have read world literature all our lives.
I'll just interject here because, who knows, means everyone should know the translator of Kafka, or for that matter, Camus, or those,
They don't, right?
Asterix stories, for example.
Yeah.
Nobody knows.
Most people don't.
People don't.
And you read it. You read that literature, and that's the job of translation, to make the literature available to anyone who wants to read it in their language. And that's all there is to it. It's not that translation leads to better books compared to what is being read in the language in which it was written. It doesn't matter. Books are written in a language, they're read either in the same language or in another language. That's fine. If suddenly it seems that in India the translated books are fantastic and writing in English is paling in comparison, take into account the fact that for translations you've got 100 years of literature, and it's easy to pick the best of the lot. And when it's writing in English, you can only publish what's written recently. So naturally, there's a little bit of an imbalance over there, right? So I don't think these things matter very much. Good books are good books. And what makes a good book is something that I don't think anyone knows. The writer doesn't know, the publisher doesn't know, the translator doesn't know. You bet on it.
Publisher should know, right?
You bet on it. You say that I think this is a good book. But is it a great book? Will readers take to it? Will it have sales 50 years down the line? I don't think anyone is in a position to know those things, right? I also believe that if Shanko's Chorangi had come out today, it would not have made the kind of impact that it did 15 years ago, because there was there weren't enough books out there. There were only a handful of books being written in English and being published in English and being read in English. So the field was wide open, which is why now when you choose what to translate, you're actually looking at two things. One, of course, is that you have certain wider considerations. For example, voices, under less privileged voices, voices which have not been heard so much. Here's an opportunity to amplify in a different language with a pan-Indian and possibly global reach. So these considerations play a part. I think publishers also feed into this strategy to some extent with the hope that it will attract readers. But beyond the point, I don't think in 200 years of publishing anyone's got a formula, right? Other than very obvious things like 50 Shades of Grey or so on, where one book works, a second book works, a third book works, but then that's it. It also ends after that. So I don't know. As a publisher, you will know this better.
No, I don't think that there is any formula. As a publisher, we are excited about almost all the books we think are, good books, and we try to champion them as much as we can. But the bad news is that in India, publishing is not an industry till date. We are not even a part of the mainstream media industry. So it's due to that reason we have to work within a very limited budget, which has its impact on its marketing and publicity. But that's a separate discussion. So coming back to our, subject, is Anindita, do you think that there is any fight between the English and Indian bhasha, means Bharatiya bhasha? That by that I mean that people who are writing in, English in general, and books which are getting translated. Do you think that there is this perception that people who write in English, probably, they are not able to capture the essence of, the life or, our surroundings? Whereas, people who are translating, I'm not going into the quality of translation, but whose books, those stories are able to capture the essence. I just want to know, as an editor, and then as a writer, what do you think about it?
I mean, I think there have been decades of literary discourse on the idea of Indian writing in English and how that's a genre in itself. And like I said, I think English is an Indian language, so we must, Indian writers writing in English are, contemporary Indian writers writing in English are to be treated as any other contemporary Indian writers writing in their own language. That said, to kind of deviate slightly, I think since our conversation is about Indian tales, I think there is a danger, as Adiche spoke, danger of a single story. What is an Indian tale? And I think that also, since a lot of, say, South Asian writers are looking at being published outside of India, I do think that there's still one kind of story or a few kinds of stories that are considered Indian tales. I'm afraid I don't think we've moved beyond war, violence, poverty, corruption. If you look at the new books that have been published abroad, you'll find very few exceptions. There are exceptions, but there's still one kind of Indian tale that is recognized as an Indian tale abroad. We haven't been able to move beyond that, which is a fight because it's unfair, because growing up as a reader in India of English literature, we've grown up consuming the minutiae of the lives of middle-aged white men. And I too, as an Indian writer writing today, should have the right to talk about the minutiae of my life in my books. But I think there is less space for that because there is still a certain kind of story, a big story that's expected from India. I know of manuscripts that are called too quiet, so we don't have the privilege of writing a quiet book if you want to be published abroad. So we should be open to many stories, many kinds of Indian tales. There is no one Indian tale.
Actually, I think this idea of Indian tales, Indian literature does not exist, right? And we are forcibly creating it because we happen to be a geographical entity and so on. So you can't really, as Anindita said, unless there's an artificial way of standing outside and looking in. From a distance, you see India a particular way. But those of us who live here and write here don't see India in that one way at all. We write about the spaces we inhabit and the spaces we know, right? And that's not India. I mean, a book, take some of the marvelous books that have been written here in Kerala, which we've been fortunate enough to read in translation. Valli, for example, or Mustache before that, two books I can think of, published recently. we live in Delhi. Can we read those books and say, hey, this is my country, my space? It's not. It's very clearly a very different kind of space. So, this Indian literature business is bunkum. Doesn't exist.
So in that case, there is no Indian tales.
There is no India. There are many tales from the geopolitical entity called India, which itself is now a stable formation, but historically was not. And many people also now want it to become fluid as well and expand further, but that's another story.
But coming to our present reality, you do agree that there is a certain perception of a story from India
Absolutely.
for writers in English.
Absolutely.
I feel if you're writing in a regional language, you have more leeway
Yes.
because the book is, by virtue of being what it is, by virtue of being written, who it's written by, already has a certain localization or exotic element, which I think I think exotic is a wrong word to use, but a certain inbuilt authenticity which international readers would seek. I think it's harder for contemporary Indian writers in English to bring in that perceived authenticity because a certain kind of story is expected.
Yeah, I think too much is made of the fact that a book is in English. Look at somebody like Hansda Sovendra Shekhar, who happens to write in English, but he cannot be equated with an urban literature at all. He's writing from a very different space. Look at many of the books that are written by the writers from the 7 states in the northeast of India, who happen to write in English, but who are not writing about the same Bombay, Bangalore, Delhi, Madras kind of space at all. So we're too hung up on, this is an English book and therefore it's not real, it must be about rich people and privileged people and so on. We should make people forget about the fact that it's written in English. People should read the book for what it is, in the language in which they want to read it. And we have the great opportunity here where everybody, if we had a robust ecosystem of translation, hate that word ecosystem, but still, if we had a robust, robust also, all MBA speak, if we had a way in which books were freely translated between all the languages that are read in India, imagine how wonderful it would be to be able to read these vast and rich literatures in the language of your choice. Whatever language that might be, doesn't matter. I could be living in Kerala and I might want to read in Gujarati.
There's a speaker here, actually, I met her, Leela Sarkar, who translates from Bengali to Malayalam. And I think those translations between Indian languages getting rarer because we use English as the kind of middle language. So I think it's quite fascinating.
But the thing is that, when you do that, which stories, I'm talking about from the point of view of publisher, when a translation is selected, and I was sharing this with someone that we are really enthusiastic about translations. We need a good story, we need a reasonably good translation. If we have a reasonably good translation, you know how it works, right? Editors chisel a bit and then it works well. But question is that, so you are into writing, editing. I know that how it works here from the point of view of a publisher. But as an editor, how do you think that which tales are Indian tales, if at all we can call this Indian tales, which narratives are identified, which narratives are selected? Means a classic example is when Manoranjan Bepari's first book was translated. Sage published it, and then you translated 2 books of Manoranjan Da. So it's a great example. But what do you think, means how this selection process, who identifies which book should be translated? I'm not talking about the publisher's point of view here, but general in the ecosystem, again, ecosystem is the word. That how do we do that? Means how do we think about it? In the academics, for example, why books from the northeast of India, for example, when you mentioned in quote unquote, mainland Delhi, why these books are not included in the syllabi? Because canonization is very important, right? To make those Indian writing in English became Indian writing in English because they were included in the university syllabi. So please throw some light on this.
Well, I think in the absence of publishing companies having somebody or more people with an eye on the literatures in the other languages, the English publishing system, all publishing systems actually, nobody has people who are actually keeping an eye open for literatures in the other languages that they would like to publish in translation. So in the absence of that those kinds of people, which actually are there in the publishing companies of the West, it's up to the translators. And the translators pick based on their personal taste, personal choice, how much they're being hustled by certain writers, who's calling you 3 times a day saying, translate my book, translate my book, translate my book. Or, well, that's the thing, people will do what they can. So to cut through the clutter, as it were. And then there is this whole notion that reading has become something of virtue signaling now. So, it's great that so many writings by Dalit writers are being translated and published, but I really fear that the day someone realizes that the virtue signaling is ended, it will be dropped like a hot potato. Are those books being published for the real intrinsic value? Maybe they are, maybe they are not, I don't know. In the same way, there have been various waves: publish this kind of writer, publish this kind of book, not necessarily because they're going to appeal to readers because of their intrinsic content or material, but because everyone's reading in that space, that kind of book. Everyone wants to. You remember a few years ago, there was a lot of talk about Savarna as a class and so on, so everyone got very guilty. Then there was a time when college students would precede everything that they said by starting out by saying, I'm very sorry for my privilege. But, so, it's become very weird. It's all become very weird, what you're allowed to read, what you're not allowed to read. 10 other people will be watching, oh my God, you read so-and-so, you're a loser. Or, oh wow, you read so-and-so, tell us who to read. So it's, you're a thought leader, you're an influencer. That old business of just withdrawing from the world with a book you love and reading it, and many people doing the same, I think is gone.
But I'm interested, right, in asking both of you, if you do truly believe that there is a specific DNA of an Indian tale. I was at this session by Janice Pariat right before, and she was speaking about Khasi oral tradition, how the stories were passed down as songs. I'm editing this artist's catalog right now. She's from Bastar, Shanti Bai. They have a tradition of carving stories, not even painting on pillars. It's immensely laborious. Imagine pattachitras, but imagine carving that on wood. So usually the artists from Bastar do that as a memorial pillar. When someone dies, you carve the story of their life on wood. But she has decided to carve her own story while she's living. She's fascinating. So the idea that I feel that Indian tales are rather form agnostic. In Bengali, a colloquial way to ask someone what movie they watched is ki boi dekhle, and boi is the word for book. So you're actually referring to a movie as a book. So in the sense that the storytelling or the story is more important than the clothes it's wearing, whether it's your grandmother's story or whether it's a pillar or whether it's a song. So is there something like an Indian tale? And do you believe that, say, works in regional languages capture that essence of an Indian tale better? And hence, do they connect with an average reader in a better way because they speak in the same DNA of what we are used to growing up listening to and understanding as a definition of a story?
I think it's a very important question and a very good question. So important and good questions are always tough questions. Having said that, I think the classic example is Janice's new book. I have started flipping through these pages. It's an unputdownable book. Now, again, it's a classic example of how you capture the essence of a part of the geographical entity India, because in that part of India, in Khasi Jayantia Hills, people generally read and write in English. So English is very much a part of our, I come from Northeast, so I know, that it's, an integral part of the society. Nagaland is a classic example. There are so many tribes, but they don't have a common language. So there is a language called Nagamese, which is a kind of a Creole kind of a thing, lingua franca, which is used by all the communities to communicate. Now, if you know Assamese, you can communicate with a Naga person. What I'm trying to say is that there are, stories, and Arunava said something very important, that as publishers, as thinkers, as editors, and who are in a sense, in a very idealistic way, chronicling the, you know, kind of an intellectual map of the country, we need to understand some Indian languages. At least, we should identify editors, hire editors in a way who can read in Bangla, for example, or Malayalam or Marathi, And as Arunava said, that there is no formula perhaps. There is no formula. Because I cannot, ask Manoranjan Bapari to write in a particular way. He will write what he wants to write. And the classic example is that what you said, that, which movie, which boy, is Pother Pachali. Vibhutishwan Bandyopadhyayar, that, book was adapted. I think that adaptation is less. That's why, the championing of the books is, but thanks to OTT and other things, people are now doing it a lot. But to answer that question, that, how we can do that, I think we need to understand Indian languages. We need to, start reading in Indian languages, because from my point of view, I think that, when I read a fiction in Bangla, for example, I'm privileged that I can read in Bangla and Assamese both. I, feel like, getting it, translating it from,
No, my question was, is the DNA of an Indian tale or Indian tales, whatever we are defining as Indian tales, is that different from a non-Indian tale? Is there something that's unique to it that comes from our storytelling traditions?
I think we shouldn't, divide it like that. Maybe, we can say that there is a formula writing, which we were discussing in the morning, that, you go to an MFA school and you know how to, create a, write something, basis your, training in that MFA school. Perhaps, that's the thing. But I think at the end of the day, these are, common human, various aspects of life that you bring to light in the form of a literature. So I don't know, I don't think there is an Indian and non-Indian way. I think there is only good literature, and I won't say bad literature, not good literature.
Yeah, I don't think it's so much a matter of form. I mean, all civilizations started by telling stories, right? And then at some point technology took over and gradually it went into writing, and then it was the same version for everybody. And then money and fame came into the picture. Otherwise, who remembers the writers of oral tales? But to call it Indian specifically, I think may have more. I think there are two aspects. One aspect, of course, is our socio-political realities, which are very different from those in the West or those in the East or any other country. India, the Indian regions are pretty unique that way. They have their stories which perhaps are not largely reproduced in any other parts of the world except some nations in Africa. So that would be unique, certainly, no matter when. And the fact that you've grown up perhaps more with mythology and so on. So these are things that imbue our storytelling instinctively whenever we get to that. Even the most rational of writers will use metaphors that are borrowed from mythology.
But again,
Exactly. I mean, I was getting at that. I think as a culture, we are a verbose culture, right? So the books that we write will not follow the MFA model of show, don't tell. We love to tell. And there's so much of focus on, say, dialogue, or even in our regional forms in Bengali, the dramatic recitation of Abriti is so much about the dialogues. We are so much about description. That is in our DNA as an Indian writer. So whether I'm writing in English or in Bangla, I will write that way. So if that's kind of poured into a cookie cutter mold, it doesn't work. So I do believe there is a DNA of an Indian tale.
Many DNAs, let's say, which perhaps are unique from the rest of the world.
I'd say that, another example we can look at is that, when we look at the writings from Kashmir, for example, I'll give two examples, two very popular titles. One is Rahul Pandita's Our Moon Has Blood Clot, and Basharat Peet's Curfewed Night. Now, they bring to light a certain kind of political, social reality of Kashmir. But look at the books that are published from Northeast again, Nagaland, for example, Assam, for example, or Arunachal Pradesh. We're largely, and I'm reading a very interesting, collection of short stories from Mizoram now. They only talk about the folk and the oral tradition. So again, I don't think there is one DNA, yes. And again, the realities change. Perhaps people don't want to talk about.
No, I think they want to. I think they are not allowed to. I think that's a problem. Maybe publishers want writers from Kashmir to only write about the war. I don't think a publisher will publish a teenage romance from Kashmir right now.
We published.
You did?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I want to see that book. But I think it's a matter of privilege. I think
Sarah Naveed's book you should read. It's
okay.
In POK and
But it's a love across the border thing.
yeah.
No, but they should be allowed to write about, not just about borders and wars. So when you're saying that the Mizo stories are about certain things, it's because what's expected of them.
I haven't read Mizo stories, but the stories from Nagaland, let me say this, and which are written in English. For example, Avinu Kire's new book, we brought it out. Then Isterin's, titles, and prior to that, then Mamangdai's stories from Arunachal Pradesh. They largely look at the oral tradition, folk culture, and it's not that publishers don't allow. Publishers actually look forward to. When Rahul Pandita gave the manuscript, it was part of the NIF scholarship. He got the fellowship he got. But I'm saying that I think that it varies from geographical location to location. Perhaps people are more interested in talking about oral tradition, folk from the northeast of India, wherein you see that it's too. I don't think it'll be wise to generalize it. Looking at two books, but in general, I think that people are looking at multiple aspects. And in that case, the genesis or inspiration or DNA, whatever you want to call it.
No, sure, yeah. And wherever the regions where the literatures have developed more in terms of volume, they've moved away from the oral traditions quicker. In Bengal, for example, the writing has depended more on other writings because people started reading very early on, and then the British colonizers came in and set up their centers of education in Bengal and also in Tamil Nadu and so on. So people here read more, they read the books of the West, and they started moving to those categories quicker. And as for that, it just struck me that the kind of dependence on oral storytelling you're talking about is also very prevalent in the literatures of the Arabic countries. So it's not an Indian thing per se, it's perhaps a geographical thing more than anything else, where perhaps there is less of a dependence on reason and logic and more of a willingness to make some slightly more mystical connections between things. So I think the dependence of the West on logic, on causality and so on has led to a certain kind of literature, certain kind of storytelling where X is followed by Y is followed by Z, and there has to be certain consistency. They cannot contradict one another. An editor will say, but if your person was called Ram in the beginning, how can he be called Sham now? Whereas in some parts of the world, they'll say, yeah, his name changed. What's the big deal? It happens all the time.
Right. Yeah, I'm fascinated also by how the idea of the novel itself, or what's considered a novel, has changed so rapidly, right? So I think Robinson Crusoe, possibly considered the first novel in the English language, early 18th century. I think at that time, Daniel Defoe was repeatedly asked if it's real. People were obsessed with. They read stories, but they wanted to imagine it was real. The idea of a fictional written tale wasn't a concept. And I think after the success of Robinson Crusoe, writers took great pains to underline that their novels were, verisimilitude was important, that the novels were real. And that is so not true for a novelist today. You'll take great pains to underline that nothing is true, it's all fictional. So who knows, in another 2 centuries that could of just...
Talking about championing the stories, you have translated so many books, Arunava. At one point, there was this, immense craze for Indian writing in English. Even translations were considered as Indian writing in English, because they were included in the syllabi. How do you look at the evolution, in terms of the reading and of, translation from, say, if we look at the early 2000, the 1990s, we had probably the best decade of Indian writing or fictions. But starting from 2000, and then, when you look at now, publishing world has changed. How do you look at this idea of the problem or the difficulty of, championing a book, in for the audience? Fictions especially, I'm not talking about, because non-fictions have more or less a formula that that there is a targeted audience, there are policymakers, thinkers, researchers who would. And I think in this context, if you talk about the translation projects that you do at Ashoka to an extent, which is really very amazing.
So, as we all know, we now don't consume our stories only through the written word. And stories are very much more accessible to us now thanks to OTT media. So, fiction itself has a category challenge in the sense that people are getting their stories through other means. Not that they're not getting stories, they're just not reading them in books. So back in the early 2000s, this was not there. And publishers were fairly confident that there's a huge number of readers out there. If only we can get good books across to them, they will buy them and read them. And if you already have bodies of established successful literatures in respective languages, then that's very obvious. It's a no-brainer, right? Go for those. Go for the books which have been successful in Bangla, in Marathi, in Tamil, in Malayalam, and have them translated and publish them. So that was the first phase. In phase two, what happened was that you were now suddenly competing with everyone else, right? Or among others, yeah? And social media in terms of time and attention spans. So now suddenly what you will publish, whether it is translated or whether it is written originally in English, I think has to check certain mental boxes for publishers. Because let's face it, for the writer, it's not a challenge. You write what you want to write. Of course, you hope it will be sold, but you're not really putting anything, well, you're putting your entire life and labor into it, but you're not at the end of the day putting money into it, if you know what I mean. Whereas for a publisher it's different. A publisher cannot say, I will send these books out into the world and hope for the best. There has to be a certain justification, a certain thought process, and the bigger your company is, the tougher it is, right, to explain why you think these particular titles of fiction will sell. So obviously all these considerations have changed the nature of novels and short story collections that are published. And I personally believe that publishing fiction has largely become a vanity project for editors. It is not really a very big financial strategy. It is almost that every editor is like, I'm going to publish 4 books that I love. And so, of course, they can only publish 4 or 6 or whatever the number is. So they also have to be very, very selective. I suspect, nobody will own up to this, Premenka will not, but the fact is that the number of titles has shrunk enormously, understandably.
But I'm so glad you mentioned OTT. I think it's quite a long-running conversation now. I think Sheila Heti, Mohsin Hamid have written really well on this. The idea that the birth of photography freed painting from the compulsion to be realistic, and painting could go into all these new areas, and cubism could be one. So since the onus of storytelling has been taken away from the novel, because the TV shows are doing that, the family dramas on TV are doing that, the novel is free to go in all these beautiful directions and be so much about just interiority and character and mood. And I think A Passage North is a great example of that, right? Like kind of plotless.
Or even Tombs of Sand, classic example. Yeah.
But again, the question is that, and what Arunava said, is that the platforms have changed, mediums have changed to an extent. But do we see those great adaptations in OTT, for example, these days, Let's, go beyond the world of publishing. Netflix in India apparently lost, more than 1 million subscribers in India. So the question is that, how do the people select which narrative, which story should be adapted into a movie. We haven't seen anything. I don't know. Sacred Games is a classic example. Which was adapted, and I think it did really well for Netflix.
And season 3 has been nixed.
Yes. Now
So I think actually the non-fiction adaptations have been better. Like Scam was a great adaptation, but Netflix particularly has made some really bad choices. And not all books translate to this 8-episode format, right? You need certain beats. You need each episode to end in a certain way.
Suitable Boy, for example, was, I think, a good success.
Which one?
Suitable Boy, Vikram.
I really disliked it, but
Okay. No, I'm not talking about, but I think that overall, commercially it did well. It was an adaptation. And question is that, whether OTT producer thinking twice before, producing or adapting a novel into an OTT series. You were talking about this.
I think it's nice to have a ready story, but even now, if you see the kind of books that are being picked for adaptation, it's more, it's a known author, and people vaguely know the book, and then it gets adapted. I don't really think there have been any successful fiction adaptations of late. I mean, Leila happened and it was terrible. So I can't think of anything. Non-fiction has been adapted well. So Scam was really good. Yeah. Can you think of good adaptations?
I am absolutely,
to TV?
I know nothing. I don't watch films on OTT at all, or even on big screens. So I know nothing. All I know is that it is very dangerous if writers start writing for eventual adaptation on the screen.
That is happening.
Yeah, but that is dangerous because then you're writing in one medium but actually trying to meet the needs of another. You might as well write directly for that medium then. It doesn't work that way. And I found that because an agent who sells scripts sat down with me one day and went through all my translations to say, you've got so many, can't we push some of them out for adaptation? And each one came up and they looked at it and said, no, this won't do. No, this won't do. No, this won't do. And the reasons were one, no, this is history, won't do. No, this needs very elaborate sets, won't do. 3, there's no story in this, won't do. 4, too many women in this, 5, won't do. 6, no women in this. So I realized that these things were not written for that medium, so it's fine. But if today you write hoping that your work will be adapted on the screen for the money, because it will not be your story by the time it goes out
like
there.
Age of Vice is a good example, right? I think it kind of was written thinking of TV in mind, and it worked.
But
So maybe there's a way to straddle that.
So there are some stories you can write that way, of course. But the point is that then you keep that in mind. So you're pushing it out into 2 media at the same time.
But Sunil Ganguly said that he never liked Arunava Sihna when Ray adapted this into a movie.
Liked or not, it was not his story anymore. That's for sure.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But again, 2 books, Chaurangi and Middleman, both of them are adapted into movies. They are, and
Who doesn't want their book to be made into a film? Like here, Colum McCann, I think he was working with J.J. Abrams for his book adaptation. Jonathan Franzen, I know, spent 2 years in a writer's room trying to adapt Purity, and it fell through. So even, the big guys fall into the temptation.
Yeah, well, I have 2 quotes for you. One, when Jhumpa Lahiri was asked about the namesake, she said, the film, she said, it's Meera Nair's film. It's not my book. I mean, she didn't say it's not my book, but that's what she said. Meera Nair's film. And Shankar, when asked about the movie adaptations of his novels, said, once you've given your daughter off in marriage, that's it. She belongs to someone else. She's not yours anymore.
Terribly patriarchal.
Of course, it's a
reference,
patriarchal, typically patriarchal metaphor.
But I do agree. I feel if you are selling your film rights, you have to relinquish control and you have to give it to someone who you trust. You can't try to, the filmmaker has to do with it what works best for their medium, and they need to be good in craft. Often a lot of writers want kind of sign-off credit, but I think the best ones don't, because you have to let go,
right? So what I'm getting at is that if that is your ultimate ambition, you don't have to go to the pain of writing a novel. You can just write a treatment, It's quicker, it's snappier, and it meets the needs better than having portion that you have to then remove or change and so on.
So I, to an extent, agree, but I'd like to disagree. But that's not the thing, because some of the, very well-known books were adapted into movies and they were classics.
No, absolutely, I'm not disputing that. What I'm getting at is that that's not the reason you write. That's all I'm saying.
Precisely. So on this happy note, we come to the end of our discussion.